Number 1. The Tomb. I stopped being involved in trick-or-treating around the time I was 12 or 13 years old. That's pretty on point for most people that I hear who stopped doing that, and it wasn't something I missed much. I started hanging out with friends and watching scary movies and things like that on Halloween. It was when I was 16, when I had the scariest Halloween of my entire life. My two best buddies, Jack and Tom, wanted to go exploring in the night. I mean, they believed in ghosts and things like that, and they thought they would be able to see one on Halloween. We all sort of lived out in the country. Jack, however, absolutely lived way out in the country. And that was not the most interesting thing about him, though. He knew about an old cemetery that was also way out in the country. They were supposedly some mountain folk, as Jack liked to call them. They had their own cemeteries out in the hills. They lived all their lives out there, so it made sense they'd want to be buried there. We got together to go out in the hills pretty early in the afternoon. And don't get me wrong, we weren't hiking through trees or something like that. We took Jack's car, and we drove through the country roads into the hills. It took a while, but eventually we turned on a road that led to an old rickety gate. We were not able to drive into the gate, it was too small. So we got out. Walking past the gate, we arrived at the old cemetery, and it was a pretty interesting place. I don't want you to think this was some weird hick sort of thing. This was a real, fenced-in graveyard with real gravestones. I wish I could remember the name of it, but I cannot. It wasn't like Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, where there is basically nothing there. But the stones were old, and a little eroded. But it was also unattended. Trees and other plant life had grown over it. It was definitely a spooky thing to experience on Halloween. We were young, and not really skeptical. So in a way we were hoping that we would experience a ghost or something like that. We came upon a tomb that was about in the middle of the graveyard. This whole time, I actually expected that Jack had been to the graveyard before. I mean, he had driven there, and wasn't following a map or anything like that. So I also thought, being the prankster that Jack happened to be, that he was probably setting something up to try and scare Tom and me. And when we got to that tomb, it seemed like the perfect setup. "So, you guys want to go in?" Jack asked. Tom was hesitant to go in. I was hesitant in a different way. Like I was expecting Jack to do something. He was a good practical joker, but he had to think that we would be hesitant to go into the tomb, so he might play the joke outside the tomb. So I wasn't sure which one to do. "I'll go in first if you two are too chicken," Jack told us. He walked over, and the door to the tomb was ajar. My suspicion was that he had been in there before, and left it that way. I did not follow Jack into the tomb. For a few moments it was quiet. I was waiting for the jump scare to come. I braced myself for it, waiting. I waited longer, and longer. "Jack," I called out to him, "you're not scaring us." No answer. "Jack, just come on out," I told him. No answer. I told Tom that I thought we'd have to play this out. Jack wasn't going to give in, so we might as well go in the tomb and get it over with. "We're coming in, Jack, but we won't be surprised," I yelled. We slowly went in and opened the door. Jack was lying on the floor. As I got closer to him, I noticed two things. Jack was bleeding from the head, and he wasn't breathing. I quickly moved Jack onto his back I made sure I was right, and yeah, he was dead. He was not breathing at all. I started performing CPR immediately. Fortunately, we had learned it in driver's ed. I kept doing it, and it kept taking a whole lot of time. And I was scared that I didn't know why my friend was dead. I also didn't know what he had been hit on the head with. But I was too busy trying to get him alive again. It took a while, but he finally began breathing again. It wasn't like when you see in the movie. The breathing began slowly, and Jack wasn't really Jack yet. He was breathing and his eyes were open, but I could tell there was nothing behind the eyes. And Tom and I got Jack back up. We were able to get him out of the cemetery and into the car. From there, we had to drive him to the hospital. And we did. Jack wasn't Jack for a while. I don't know how to explain it. He didn't talk to anyone and barely moved. After about a week, he began trying to bite everyone. And when he finally began getting his personality back, we tried to figure out what had happened. All he remembered was quickly seeing someone and getting his head hit with a rock. But when we went back to the tomb, there was no one there, and no rock that had blood on it. We didn't see anyone when we went into the tomb. I don't think Jack did that to himself. I mean, that would be the dumbest prank of all time because he would have killed himself. So to this day, we don't know who attacked Jack, and we don't know what really happened. We've gone back to the tomb several times, and each time, there's been nothing. Number 2. Trick or Treat. I've heard a lot of trick-or-treating stories this year, but none of them mention what trick-or-treating was like for me. Some of them have people driving into town to go trick-or-treating, but for me and my family, we live pretty far out in the country. We didn't drive into town to go trick-or-treating. We drove around in the hills to go trick-or-treating. We would drive on the dirt roads up and down hills, reaching the houses out in the hills, and it was expected if people kept their lights on. However, I should mention that there were some houses of very religious people who thought Halloween was an immoral holiday. They would put signs on the driveway in order to keep trick-or-treaters away. Oh, another thing I want to mention before going into the story. This was a long time ago. This was long before people started believing that Halloween treats had to be checked for things like poison or razor blades or anything. So we would get things like apples and other sort of things, like cupcakes or cookies. In fact, we also got things like caramel apples and fudge. Wrapped up candy was not something that we really got at all that time. Anyway, we had a lot of kids in my family, and I was one of the youngest. So even though my dad used to drive me trick-or-treating earlier in my life, once my older brother got old enough to drive the pickup truck, he would drive us out to go trick-or-treating. My older brothers, who are still alive today, and very, very country boy types to this day, were way more like that when I was younger. But they always carried pocket knives with them wherever they went. Often where they went was out in the hills. As they got older, they also began carrying BB guns. However, when they got into their early teens, they also began to be allowed to carry rifles. Both of my older brothers always carried their rifles. Another thing is that my older brothers were driving the old pickup truck when they reached the age of 13. They were actually taught to drive at a younger age. I was too. But they were allowed to drive out by themselves and drive out with us kids. And that is what happened on the Halloween night that this story took place. I was 11 years old at the time, and so I was at an age where I could still get scared of things. And we were getting ready to go trick-or-treating. This was happening on Halloween night. And they didn't have it on different days back then. You just went on Halloween. And trick-or-treating was meant to do at night too. My older brothers got to drive us out when we went trick-or-treating. And by this time, they actually were driving the car, not the pickup truck. And that was somewhat rare. But my mom didn't want them taking the truck out in the dark. She thought doing this would be a lot scarier for me and my younger brother and sister. So it was 5 of us in the car, and we drove out into the country to go trick-or-treating. It was pretty straightforward. If people were not participating in trick-or-treating, there would be some indication of this at the end of the driveway. However, most of our neighbors out there were taking part, and we got lots and lots of treats. We didn't drive up to the houses, though. We pulled slightly into the driveway, got out of the car, and then walked up to the houses. And that was the procedure. I wasn't really scared, driving around at night in the hills. I was used to it. Me and my brothers had their rifles in the car, in case something bad were to happen. But the country is a lot less frightening when you live out in it. We had been out for a while when we came upon a house that we really didn't know. They didn't have a sign or anything on their mailbox, but there were also no lights or anything coming from inside the house. There was an old pickup truck there by the house, though. My brothers weren't sure about going to a house with no lights. I should point out that, unlike a lot of older brothers, mine did not want to scare us. They were good guys, and were actually very protective of us. But once they got talking about it, they thought that maybe it would be cool to do something for Halloween. And maybe the people who lived in that house wanted to do something scary. And so they got us kids out of the back of the car, and it was a long and dark driveway that we began walking on. I have to admit to being scared. We walked up the dark driveway. We then walked up the steps onto the porch. My older brothers were in the lead. It was my oldest brother, Jeb, who knocked on the door. And when he did, the door opened just a little bit. It wasn't closed or locked in any way. It was quiet. Not only was there no answer to the door knocking, there were no sounds at all. Jeb knocked on the door again. Again, not only did no answer come, but there were no noises at all. "Hey there," Jeb yelled out. It's okay if you ain't giving out candy, but I just want to make sure you're okay in there." There was again no answer. Jeb turned to our other older brother. "Take the kids back to the car," he instructed. "I'm going to go in the house, just to make sure no one is hurt or worse. The door's not locked, so I'm guessing someone's home." And so my brother Chet began to take us back. I kept looking over my shoulder. I was interested as to what might have been going on, but we got back to the car. Before we got in the car, we heard a noise, and Jeb came running out of the house. He did not say anything, but just ran to the car. He then went over to the driver's door and threw up. He got into the car, making sure all of us were in there. When your older brother is obviously scared of something, you end up being scared of something. That is a guarantee. And all of us younger kids were terrified, wondering what could have happened to scare Jeb. "Just don't worry," Jeb told us. "We're just going to go home." You could hear the fear in his voice, and that made us even more scared. My 2 younger siblings were crying, and I was doing my best to keep them calmed down. But it was hard, if you could have seen the terror in Jeb's face. He drove us fast home, and when he did, he told us to wait in the car while he went to talk to Dad. After a little while, Jeb and Dad came out of the house. Dad was carrying his shotgun. He told Chet to take us into the house and lock the door. He and Jeb went out. It was hours later when Dad and Jeb came home, but it was a bit longer before Jeb told us what had happened. Dad wanted him to tell us because he figured we would be more afraid if we didn't know. Jeb went into the house. He found a naked woman dead on the bed in the bedroom. She had been stabbed in the chest. A man was alive but passed out, laying with his arm over her. She was not breathing and he was. There were whiskey bottles on the bed, and Jeb figured the guy must have murdered her and then passed out drunk. And Jeb had run out because he was terrified the guy might get up. My dad called the law, and then he and Jeb went back to the house to make sure the guy didn't leave. I don't know much else about the story. My dad wouldn't let us listen to anything about it on the radio. And it happened so long ago that I haven't seen any articles about it online. I assume the guy went to jail. The one thing I did know is that he was arrested for the murder. But beyond that, it's nothing I know. Number 3. The Porch. Halloween is my favorite holiday. I love giving out candy to trick-or-treaters and things like that. However, I did have one Halloween that did not go very good for me. I was living alone in a 2-bedroom house that I bought when I was only 19 years old. This story happened 5 years after that. The house I bought was a bit out in the country. That's why I was able to get it for as cheap as I did. But it was a nice house. On this Halloween, people drove up to my driveway, got out of the house, and they came onto my porch for treats. So I would sit in my rocking chair, dressed as a witch, and give out Reese's peanut butter cups. I know everyone likes those. After the trick-or-treating was over, it was dark outside. I went inside my house and decided to watch some TV. I did this for several hours, and at one point I dozed off. I woke up to hear a noise. Looking up, I went over to my front door, and I looked out the window. Someone was on my porch. I heard some movement. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer. "Is anyone there?" I asked. I grabbed a poker from my fireplace, and then I walked over to the front door. I looked out the window and didn't see anything. I immediately began thinking it was a raccoon, or something like that. I opened up the door just a little bit, and saw these terrifying eyes looking directly at me. When I did, there was a mountain lion sitting on my porch, and it was tearing apart a deer that was on my porch. I immediately closed the door. I didn't want the lion to think I had any intention of taking its Halloween treat. Those eyes told me to go away, and I went away. I didn't call out animal control or anything like that. I know the lion had done nothing wrong. I didn't want them to do anything about it, but it pretty much had me trapped in my home. It was weird. I didn't think this was a normal thing for a mountain lion to do. I mean, it must have chased the deer into my yard, and then just decided to eat it there. It was there for a long time, and I just waited, and waited for it to eventually leave. And when the mountain lion finally left, I nervously went to the door and opened it, to see the bloody mess it had left behind. I know some people might not think this is a very scary story, but if you've never looked into the eyes of a mountain lion on your porch, consider yourself lucky. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. I have a shout out tonight for Cameron Hope. It's always nice to make new friends. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you would like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. But most of all, make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.